Hey guys, tonight we begin under a blazing ancient sky, where the sun isn't a ball of gas, he's a god with flawless abs and an ego hotter than July in Athens. You're standing on dry, golden grass. The wind barely stirs the leaves of an olive tree nearby. Somewhere off to your right, a lyre twangs a note so pure it makes your teeth hurt. That's because Apollo, yes, the Apollo, is passing through, and when he walks, the air seems to shimmer just a bit more. His hair is gold like molten sunlight. His tunic, if you could call it that, looks like it was designed by someone who ran out of fabric but not confidence. And he knows it. This is a guy who's been worshipped since the 8th century BCE, who's got shrines from Delphi to Delos, who rides a literal chariot of fire across the sky. You, poor mortal soul, are just trying to stay in the shade and avoid eye contact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Apollo, in case you haven't guessed, isn't big on humility. Son of Zeus and Leto, twin brother of Artemis, he was born on a secret island while his mom was running from Hera, Zeus's very jealous wife. Classic Olympian drama. But Apollo came out glowing and golden, with enough talent to make every other deity a little bit nervous. He was the god of music, poetry, prophecy, plague, medicine, and oh yes, light. Basically, if it's beautiful or dangerous, Apollo had a hand in it. On this particular day, Apollo is feeling extra smug. He's just defeated Python, the giant serpent that guarded the Oracle of Delphi. Think of it as an ancient press release that screams new god in town. He's riding high, tuning his lyre with one hand and flexing with the other. You watch as he steps lightly over stones and dry thorns, golden sandals never quite touching the dirt. This is a god who knows he's trending. Now here's the quirky tidbit: Apollo supposedly also invented the lute, the bow, and possibly the concept of personal branding. He had cult followers before cults were cool. But as much as people loved his music and his healing touch, Apollo had a glaring weakness: his heart. And his ego. Especially when both were bruised. And that brings us to Cupid. Or more accurately, Eros, the original Greek version. Not the cherub with Valentine hearts, but a mischievous force of chaos with the face of a teen model and the emotional intelligence of a wasp. One afternoon, Apollo, flush with victory and possibly drunk on ambrosia, mocked Eros for playing with weapons. Not a great idea when you're dealing with a god whose entire vibe is "I ruin lives with love for fun." Historians still argue whether this encounter was written to humble Apollo or simply to explain why laurel leaves became symbols of poetic victory. Either way, Eros took it personally. So while you're stretching under that olive tree, trying to look invisible, Eros is quietly notching 2 arrows. One, gold-tipped, sparks irresistible desire. The other, blunt and lead-tipped, kills love on contact. Eros doesn't need much time. He aims the gold one at Apollo, bam. The god is instantly overwhelmed with lust. Then he casually aims the lead one at a nearby girl lounging by the river. Her name is Daphne. She's not wearing anything fancy. Her hair is messy in that perfect, effortless way. She's chewing a fig and watching the clouds like she's got nowhere to be in centuries to get there. She doesn't even notice the sting of the arrow at first. But a second later, she sits up, heart racing, skin crawling. You know that sensation when someone starts liking you, and your whole body goes, nope? That's Daphne now. Back to Apollo, he turns, sees her, and that's it. The god who survived wars, plagues, and public performances without a mic just melts. You can almost hear his inner monologue, that one. That's my soulmate. She's perfect. I love her hair. I love her elbows. I bet she knows all the chords to Stairway to Heaven. He picks up his lyre, plucks a few seductive notes, and struts over like a golden retriever with a trust fund. Daphne, meanwhile, takes one look at this glowing sun god sashaying her way and thinks, oh no, not today, Zeus Jr. She bolts. Here's your reality check. You probably won't survive this chase. Not because it's dangerous, but because the awkwardness is terminal. Imagine being the embodiment of daylight and getting swerved by a forest nymph with zero patience for poetry. But Apollo, now enchanted and enchanted by enchantment itself, can't help it. This is the kind of myth that pulses with contradiction. Historians debate whether it's about love or obsession, agency or punishment. Was Daphne always meant to be a tree? Or was she just trying to be left alone in a world where even gods don't take no for an answer? But for now, you lean back against your tree, feel the heat from Apollo's footsteps as he starts to follow, and watch as the drama unfolds, sunlight flickering through laurel leaves, a chase beginning that will change myths, art, and love stories for centuries. The chase begins so fast you barely register the blur of golden limbs and flowing hair. Apollo, normally composed like a statue from the neck down, forgets dignity and sprints after Daphne like a lovesick teenager who just saw his soulmate disappear into a farmer's market. You can practically hear his sandals slapping the ground behind her, lyre forgotten, pride dissolving in the summer heat. You follow behind, not literally, that would be suicidal, but in the voyeuristic, omnipresent way bedtime stories allow. Through groves of olive trees and stretches of wild thyme, Daphne dashes like the forest itself is helping her escape. Her bare feet make no sound. Her breath is steady. She doesn't look back, because she already knows what she'd see, a golden god with fire in his eyes and no concept of boundaries. This is not your average ancient love story. Most Greek myths are full of ambivalence toward divine romance, part reverence, part warning. But this one hits different. You feel the tension, the imbalance. On one side, a powerful deity inflamed by supernatural desire. On the other, a mortal girl armed with speed, willpower, and increasingly blistered heels. Now here's your historical fact for the night. In ancient Greece, athleticism wasn't just admired, it was divine. The Olympics weren't just for sport, they were sacred rituals honoring gods like Apollo. And guess who else was praised for sprinting? Women like Atlanta, who could outrun anyone and demanded foot races to choose a husband, though spoiler, that also ended badly. Back in the grove, Apollo's gaining. Not because he's faster, he's not, but because divine stamina is a cheat code. Daphne's hair is sticking to her back. She can feel the weight of pursuit, the pressure of being wanted in a way that isn't flattering but oppressive. This isn't flirtation. It's fear wrapped in gold and dripping with honeyed compliments. Apollo's voice is just behind her now. He's pleading, cajoling, throwing every poetic line he can conjure mid-sprint. Slow down, lovely nymph. I am no villain. I am not chasing to harm you. I just want to worship you. Share my realm. My lyre. My radiant personality. If he were mortal, it might almost be sweet. But he's not, and Daphne knows it. You can feel her pulse hammering in your chest. Her legs ache. The sun is unrelenting. And worst of all, no one is coming to help. Because when gods chase mortals, nobody interferes, unless they're family. And thank the river gods for that. Out of breath, Daphne veers off the path and heads for the banks of the river Peneus, where the water sparkles cold and blue under an oppressive sun. There, trembling and desperate, she calls out, not to Apollo, not to the heavens, but to her father. Her father, Peneus himself, god of this river and keeper of its moods, rises from the water in a swirl of foam and wind. He sees her terror, sees Apollo thundering down the hillside like a golden storm, and knows there is only one way to grant his daughter the safety she begs for. He does not argue. He does not hesitate. As you watch, Daphne's body begins to change. It starts at her feet. Toes twist, lengthen, root themselves into the damp soil. Her skin darkens and hardens, bark blooming where there was once sweat and sunburn. Her arms lift involuntarily to the sky. Fingers extend into slender green leaves. Her chest slows its rise and fall as breath becomes wind, as heartbeat becomes sap. By the time Apollo skids to a halt before her, gasping and glowing, she is no longer a girl. She is a laurel tree. He reaches out, barely believing it. Touches her bark, smooth and cool. Whispers her name. The wind answers, rustling her leaves. He presses his cheek to her trunk, desperate and grieving in the way only a god can grieve, immortally, eternally. It's a strange sort of heartbreak to witness. You almost feel for him, almost. But this is a tragedy of his own making. His love, weaponized by arrows, became a chase, and that chase ended not in union but in transformation. Daphne didn't die. She escaped. She became something Apollo could never possess, only honor. And that's exactly what he does. Right there, kneeling in the dirt, he plucks a few leaves from her branches, just enough to make a wreath. He places it on his head, not as a crown of conquest, but as a symbol of eternal devotion. He promises she will be his tree, his sacred symbol. Poets, victors, prophets, All will wear leaves in his name. Which is a bit ironic, if you think about it. You've seen those laurel wreaths in textbooks, in Olympic logos, on coins. You might even have one stamped in gold foil on an old certificate buried in a drawer. But did you know they come from a heartbreak? From a woman who literally turned into a tree to get away? Historians still argue whether this myth was meant as a romantic allegory, a warning about male entitlement, or just an origin story for ritual headgear. Some scholars say it reflects ancient views of women's roles, how they were seen as passive objects of divine pursuit. Others suggest Daphne's transformation is an act of agency, one of the few in mythology where a female figure avoids the fate of being conquered, married, or worse. Meanwhile, artists adore this story. It's got everything: drama, beauty, impossible longing, and the ultimate mic drop in the form of botanical metamorphosis. You'll see a lot more of that in later centuries, looking at you, Renaissance sculptors. But tonight, you just watch as Apollo sits beside the laurel, head bowed, his divine glow dimmed. He hums a soft tune, one you swear you recognize, and for the first time since you met him, he seems almost human. You linger in the hush that follows, a golden god kneeling beside a newly born tree, his heart trying to catch up to reality. The air holds its breath. The laurel's leaves shimmer slightly in the breeze, as if shaking off the last of Daphne's humanity. And Apollo? He does what many mortals do after rejection: he rewrites the story in his favor. He declares the laurel tree sacred. No one may harm it. Poets will wear leaves as crowns. Victors will be honored with her branches. Her transformation becomes a metaphor, her silence a symbol of purity, her resistance recast as divine inspiration. A clever rebrand, really. If you can't have the girl, make sure everyone knows you loved her so much, you turned her into culture. And you can't help but admire the audacity. Here's a mainstream historical fact for your sleepy mind to chew on: the laurel wreath did become one of the most powerful symbols in the ancient world. In the Pythian Games, second only to the Olympics, victors were crowned with laurel as a mark of both physical and poetic excellence. Even Roman emperors, centuries later, adopted the wreath, though, let's be honest, Julius Caesar made everything about himself. But back in your dreamscape, Apollo isn't in PR mode yet. He's still at her side, occasionally brushing his fingers along the bark. You hear him murmur something about how she was meant for glory. You roll your eyes. Men. That's when another little god slinks into the frame. Cupid, aka Eros, watches from the shade, leaning against an olive trunk with a satisfied smirk and a bow that's still warm from action. You see the gold arrow missing from his quiver. You see the lead one glinting faintly. And you realize this wasn't an accident. This was theater. Cupid didn't just react, he orchestrated this. Apollo insulted him, and this? This was revenge served with style. A god of love weaponizing affection to humiliate the god of perfection? That's a grudge match worthy of the Iliad. Here's the quirky tidbit of the night. According to fringe mythological sources, Eros had a habit of messing with gods who got too big for their sandals. In one story, he makes Zeus fall in love with a goose. In another, he curses Hades with an awkward crush on a dryad with hay fever. Some ancient playwrights even depict Eros as a trickster spirit, not so much a cherub as an agent of chaos with a flair for matchmaking and mischief. Historians still argue whether Cupid's role in the Daphne story is meant to highlight love's power or simply its cruelty. Was he punishing Apollo for arrogance, or was he making a broader point, that even the brightest gods are at the mercy of something as irrational as a crush? Because let's be honest, that's what this whole myth is. A divine crush. Not love. Not devotion. Just infatuation on steroids. The kind that burns hot, fast, and without consent. You've probably seen it play out in a high school hallway, or in a million pop songs. The relentless pursuit. The denial. The drama. Only here, the ending comes with bark and leaves instead of a breakup text. And the laurel? She doesn't get a say afterward. She becomes a symbol, not a speaker. You start to wonder, what if Daphne had turned around? What if Apollo had slowed down? What if Cupid had fired the arrows the other way? But myths don't usually traffic in what-ifs. They're cautionary tales wrapped in poetry, sacred geometry made from heartbreak. Still, some modern scholars push back. They say Daphne's story might be much older than Apollo's version. Some even suggest she's a remnant of an earlier tree goddess cult, a primal earth spirit reabsorbing herself into nature rather than being conquered by civilization's golden boy. Now that changes things. Because if Daphne was once a goddess in her own right, older than the Olympians, maybe even older than myth itself, then this wasn't an escape. It was a homecoming. You lean against the trunk again, this time with more reverence. The leaves rustle overhead. A cicada hums in the background. Apollo's lyre lies beside him, and used. He's thinking. Maybe, just maybe, he understands now. It's a strange moment, watching a god learn something. But it happens. Even the most radiant beings get humbled. The question is, what do they do next? Apollo stands. He takes the laurel wreath he made and gently places it on his own head. No fanfare. No thunder. Just quiet resignation. A promise to remember. A pledge to wear his failure like a badge. And maybe, if gods dream, he dreams of her sometimes, not as a tree, not as a trophy, but as a girl who could outrun him. You walk beside him now as he returns through the grove. He pauses occasionally, touching the leaves of other trees, glancing at the river. You wonder if he hears her voice in the wind. You wonder if he ever regrets what could have been. And here's your sleepy realization, all crushes are a little ridiculous. Even divine ones. They turn rational beings into fools. They rewrite logic. They invent poetry and wars. But maybe the most honest thing about Apollo's story isn't the chase or the transformation, it's the silence that followed. Because love that doesn't listen isn't love. It's just noise. You follow Apollo in silence as he drifts back toward Olympus, the laurel wreath perched gently on his head, casting dappled shadows across his golden brow. He doesn't speak. Gods don't need to when their entire aura is one long sigh. You get the sense he's playing the whole encounter on loop in his mind, every word unsaid, every step too fast, every moment where he might have changed the outcome if he'd only paused. But no one pauses in Greek myth. Everyone runs. Daphne ran toward freedom. Apollo ran toward what he thought was love. And now, you find yourself stepping into a story that's become legend, poem, painting, and somehow still feels familiar. That bittersweet ache? The longing wrapped in guilt? Classic. The forests thin as Apollo makes his way into a clearing. This is not just any patch of earth, this is the sacred ground where myths echo long after they're spoken. Stone columns rise from the dirt, half sunk, half forgotten, like the bones of forgotten stories. It's quiet here, but not empty. Because this is where symbols are born. And that laurel wreath? It's about to become everything. Here's your historical anchor. By the 5th century BCE, laurel was no longer just a tree. It was the plant of prophecy, poetry, and prestige. The Pythia, priestess of Apollo at Delphi, chewed laurel leaves to enter trance before speaking the future. Whether that worked or was just an ancient version of microdosing is up for debate. Poets crowned their heads with it before reciting epics. Politicians wore it to invoke divine favor. Even Olympic athletes were crowned with laurel wreaths after victory, dripping in sweat and glory. All because one girl ran too fast, and one god loved too loud. The wreath, in a strange twist of fate, became the thing Apollo was never able to do, earn something. It wasn't gifted to him. It wasn't claimed by force. It was a symbol of effort, dedication, and restraint. You had to train, compete, struggle, to where laurel was to prove your worth. Apollo, in adopting it, seemed to say, from now on, we honor only what is earned. Even gods need reminders, apparently. Now for your quirky tidbit, the laurel tree has a built-in defense mechanism. When stressed, it releases a mild toxin to deter predators. Ancient healers believed burning its leaves could ward off evil, or at least obnoxious guests. And in Roman households, laurel branches were hung over doors to protect against lightning. Which makes you wonder, was Daphne still watching, even as a tree, quietly zapping anyone who got too close? You wander deeper into the grove as Apollo vanishes into memory, and you start to see how this myth grew legs, how it outran its own tragedy. Renaissance scholars couldn't get enough of it. Baroque painters immortalized the moment of transformation in exquisite, uncomfortable detail, fingers sprouting leaves, mouths frozen in mid-scream. It was beautiful, disturbing, unforgettable. But back in ancient Greece, the story wasn't just painted. It was performed. You imagine a moonlit amphitheater, packed with citizens, the air thick with wine and debate. A masked actor, arms raised in wooden branches, cries out in Daphne's voice, her final plea, her final breath before bark. And then silence, as a second actor, Apollo, stumbles on stage, lyre dangling, voice trembling. They already know the ending, but it still hits. Because stories like this weren't just for entertainment. They were mirrors. Reflections of divine flaws mapped onto mortal emotions. They gave people a safe way to explore danger, desire, regret. And as you sit on a stone bench that hasn't felt warmth in centuries, you start to feel it too. Apollo's pursuit wasn't noble. It wasn't romantic. But it was real. And what followed, grief, growth, and the slow acceptance of no, feels more human than divine. Historians still argue whether Apollo ever truly changed after Daphne. Some myths suggest he did. Others say he kept chasing different lovers, with similarly disastrous results. More on that later. Hyacinthus is coming. But in this moment, in this grove, it feels like something shifted. Like the god of light flickered, just for a moment, and saw his own shadow. You lean back against a cool stone column, vines curling around its base. Somewhere overhead, a bird sings, a sharp, descending trill that echoes like a question. You wonder if the laurel trees still whisper the story to each other when the wind is just right. You wonder if Daphne is still listening. Because here's the thing, stories live longer than gods. Longer than empires. They change, grow roots, lose leaves, bloom again in unexpected places. Daphne may not have had a voice at the end, but her silence spoke volumes. She chose stillness. She chose herself. And Apollo? He made her choice into a crown. An ironic one, sure, but also a tribute. A promise carved into every laurel grove planted in her name. You rise, brushing dust from your hands. The path ahead is shaded now, the sun dipping below the horizon, Apollo's chariot tucking behind the mountains. The myth has only just begun. Other names, other hearts will join the tale. But you'll carry this moment, the chase, the tree, the wreath, with you as you continue forward. Because sometimes, even when love fails, meaning grows anyway. You leave behind the grove, your footsteps light now, almost respectful, as if the earth remembers and resents anything loud. The story still clings to you like the smell of old laurel smoke, sharp, ancient, a little bittersweet. But before the memory fades, it shifts again. Because myths don't stand still. They ripple. They bloom sideways. Apollo, for all his heartbreak, does not retire. Gods rarely do. They grieve in strange ways. Instead of withdrawing, he turns his pain into art, as only a deity could. Music, poetry, prophecy, his divine portfolio deepens. And yet, the laurel remains. Always on his brow. Always there to remind him, not everything you desire belongs to you. That's when he gets an idea. You're back now in the halls of Delphi, where smoke rises from sacred fires and the air hums with whispers. This is Apollo's house now, taken from the old snake python, whose bones supposedly still rattle beneath the temple. That, by the way, is your quirky tidbit tonight. Some legends say the Pythia's trance states came from gas emissions rising from geological fault lines. Yes, ancient mysticism may have had a sulfurous edge. Apollo, newly crowned god of prophecy, installs his oracle, the Pythia, who chews laurel leaves, breathes vapors, and mumbles destiny. Everyone from kings to peasants lines up to ask her things they probably already know the answers to. War or peace? Plant or harvest? Marry this guy or maybe not? And always, the laurel is there. Not just on the Pythia's lips, but decorating the temple, burned in the fire, braided into the future. But even as you settle into this sacred rhythm, you can feel something lurking just beneath. Because Apollo hasn't stopped thinking about Daphne. Not really. You know this because he keeps invoking her. Every laurel wreath, every poetic competition he hosts, every prophecy whispered through trembling leaves, it's all her. It's not obsession anymore. It's worship. Strange, delayed, probably unhealthy worship. But still, it's something. So when he starts composing epic hymns and organizing contests in her honor, nobody questions it. The Delphic Games, less bloody than the Olympics, more artsy, spring up in her name. Music, lyric poetry, laurel crowns for winners. Daphne's absence has become a theme, a muse, an entire aesthetic. It's both beautiful and deeply weird. Historians still argue whether these festivals were sincere acts of remembrance or convenient rebranding exercises. Was Apollo truly mourning the woman who fled him, or just finding a tasteful way to mask an embarrassing myth? Was Daphne ever meant to be a major figure, or did her silence allow poets to project whatever they wanted? But you were there. You saw the moment she turned, not because she loved him, not because she was cursed, but because she chose another form. That kind of defiance echoes louder than any hymn. And here's the moment that seals it. As the games grow in fame, and the laurel wreath gains cultural gravity, one thing becomes quietly clear: it no longer belongs to Apollo alone. The laurel now crowns poets, runners, even philosophers. It blesses those who strive, not those who seize. In a roundabout way, Daphne's transformation shifts the entire mythos of ambition, from conquest to effort, from force to endurance. You walk through a crowd now, young athletes stretching, poets nervously rehearsing. You pass a sculptor adjusting a statue of Apollo, who stares heroically into the distance, conveniently skipping over the whole chaste tree detail. Funny how myths get polished. But just beyond that statue, half hidden behind a curtain of vines, is a smaller shrine. Not grand, not gold, just bark, stone, and silence. Daphne's shrine. No offerings, no incense, just space. And somehow, it feels more sacred than all the columns combined. You sit beside it, careful not to disturb the roots curling nearby. A single laurel branch leans toward you, leaves whispering things you can't quite hear. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's her. You close your eyes. For a second, you imagine what it might have felt like to stretch into the earth, to become part of something older than pursuit or poetry. To no longer run. To simply be. You breathe in, and the scent of crushed laurel hits the back of your throat, peppery, sharp, and oddly calming. Somehow, that smell lingers in every version of the myth. Whether told around a campfire or etched in marble, it always ends with leaves. With stillness. With the reminder that escape isn't always weakness, it can be the most powerful thing a person does. So as Apollo glides past again, this time not in pursuit but in procession, leading singers, healers, seers, you finally see him not as the sun, but as its shadow. A reflection of something brighter he couldn't catch. And maybe that's enough. Because while he may never have her, she changed him. And through him, she changed the world. The sun is high again, blazing, unrelenting, as you find yourself on a marble staircase spiraling up the side of a mountain. Apollo's temple glimmers behind you, but your focus has shifted. You're following someone else now. Not a god, not a priestess, but a young poet, barefoot, clutching a scroll like it's a lifeline. He's nervous. You can tell by the way he keeps looking at the sky, muttering lines to himself, adjusting his laurel wreath for the 12th time. He's on his way to perform at the Delphic Games, and his whole village has bet their reputations on his ability to rhyme without passing out. You sit beside him for a moment, invisible. The way bedtime stories let you do that, hover, observe, feel the heartbeat of someone ancient and familiar. He inhales sharply, then steps into the amphitheater. The crowd hushes. Somewhere, an olive branch creaks. And then he speaks. Lines pour out, smooth, vivid, full of longing. His poem is about the sun and the river, a chase and a change, a love that became something else. You know this story. Everyone does. But he tells it differently. In his version, Daphne isn't just fleeing. She's dancing, dodging fate with grace, becoming more, not less. And Apollo isn't a predator, but a fool, an unripe soul learning, slowly, that admiration doesn't equal ownership. The amphitheater exhales when he's done. You can almost hear the leaves clap. That's the funny thing about myths. The further they travel, the more they evolve. Once a cautionary tale, now it's a celebration of resilience. A feminist whisper tucked into the folds of divine drama. A reminder that stories don't belong to the teller, they belong to the listener, who reshapes them with every breath. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Hellenistic times, the cult of Apollo spread across the Mediterranean, blending with local beliefs and taking on regional twists. In Egypt, he fused with Ra. In Rome, he became a poster boy for imperial might. But no matter how far he traveled, the laurel always followed. Laurel wreaths crown emperors and generals, yes, but also philosophers, poets, doctors, anyone who chased excellence with something more than brute force. It wasn't just about speed or strength anymore. It was about meaning. Now for tonight's quirky detail. In early Roman poetry circles, competitors would literally fight for the right to wear the laurel. But if they lost, they weren't shamed. Instead, they'd place their own handmade wreaths at the base of Daphne's image, as if to say, even my failure is part of your myth. You walk now through a garden, yes, it's centuries later, and the stones have shifted, and the laurel trees have been replanted from cuttings, but the story is still alive. It clings to the trunks, whispers from the leaves. The gardeners don't even know. They're just trimming history back into neat hedges. And yet, you pass a sculptor sketching a girl mid-transformation. She's arching back, fingers stretching into twigs, mouth caught between a scream and a breath. The artist mutters, "Too stiff," and scratches again. You want to tell him he'll never capture her. She chose to be motion. She's not a statue. Historians still argue whether Daphne's voice was ever written down before Ovid's version became the default. Some claim earlier oral versions cast her as a priestess, or a minor goddess of growth and decay. Others say her silence is the point, that she resists narration because her choice defies neat endings. But you're not here for neat endings. You're here for the echoes. You sit by the fountain now, listening to water trickle over stone carved with worn Greek letters. Someone reads poetry nearby. It's not about Apollo. Not directly. It's about sunlight filtering through trees. About running. About stillness. The laurel makes a quiet cameo, almost unnoticed. That's how it should be. Because somewhere along the myth's journey from temple to terrace, from sacrifice to sonnet, the story stopped being about God's unrequited love, and started being about a girl who could not be caught. Not by force. Not by fame. Not even by memory. You lie back on the stone bench, arms tucked beneath your head. The sky above is full of late summer clouds, lazily drifting like forgotten thoughts. And as the wind stirs the garden, you swear the laurel trees lean in, just a bit, to listen. Because they've heard every version. They've been woven into victory parades and funeral songs, whispered over by emperors and schoolchildren. But this soft retelling under a pale sky, feels different. Less performance, more promise. A promise that some stories don't need conclusions. Just roots. Just leaves. Just enough silence to grow. The garden fades behind you as time folds again, not with a roar but with a sigh. You're no longer in Delphi or Rome. You're nowhere, and everywhere, cradled in myth's drifting tide. The world around you shifts into something softer, darker, older. A different kind of silence now, the kind you find deep in the woods or behind closed doors when someone's just asked the one question nobody wants to answer. You find yourself standing in the middle of an olive grove where the air is thick with night. The trees are gnarled, ancient, and leaning inward, like they've overheard things they shouldn't have. Somewhere, not far, a lyre plucks a hesitant melody. A familiar one. Apollo's song, tentative now, reworked for minor chords. And it's here that we stop pretending Greek mythology is all glowing abs and flying horses. Because here comes the part people usually skip over, the gods were terrible at consent. You walk into a memory not often spoken aloud. Countless stories ripple through the myths, nymphs chased and caught, women silenced or punished, transformations used not as liberation, but as evasion. Daphne's tale is just one branch in a twisted, ancient tree of divine pursuit and mortal flight. Tonight, you trace that bark with your fingers. Here's your historical context. In many early myths, especially pre-Homeric fragments, gods and mortals didn't fall in love, they collided. And while those myths often served to explain natural phenomena or legitimize dynastic claims, they also reflected cultural anxieties about power, autonomy, and punishment disguised as affection. Take Zeus, for instance. His greatest hits include turning into golden rain to infiltrate a locked chamber and seducing Europa as a literal bull. Romantic? Only if you're into Barnyard Stockholm Syndrome. Poseidon? Turned a priestess into a monster. Hades? Don't get us started. But Apollo? He's often seen as one of the better gods. Civilized. Artistic. Reasonable. And still, here we are. You sit beneath a knotted fig tree, letting the weight of these stories settle. They're not fairy tales, they're warnings. Coded reminders, maybe, about who holds the power and what it costs to say no. Daphne said no. And because she was clever, fast, and blessed with a river god for a dad, she got away, barely. But others weren't so lucky. Callisto. Io. Arethusa. Names that ring like bells in mythic echo chambers, each attached to some new shape, a bear, a cow, a stream. Transformed, not to become divine, but to disappear. Historians still argue whether these metamorphoses were meant as acts of mercy or cosmic punishment. Was becoming a tree, a spring, or a constellation a reward? A trap? A compromise between divinity and survival? You wander now through another clearing, this one carved with statues. All women. All mid-motion. Some twisting away, others shielding their faces. Most half-changed, hair turning to feathers, arms stretched into wings, legs dissolving into bark. It's a gallery of evasion. Of escape by any means. But Daphne stands tallest at the center, one hand still reaching skyward, one foot rooted in stone. The sculptor, likely a man, likely centuries removed from the chase, has caught the exact moment her voice disappears. You don't know whether to weep or applaud. Now for your quirky tidbit. In some lesser-known versions of the Daphne myth, she didn't want to escape. She simply didn't want Apollo. She longed for solitude, for wildness, for the company of Artemis, goddess of the hunt and famously uninterested in marriage. Some scholars even argue Daphne was queer-coded. A quiet rebellion wrapped in bark. You touch the statue's shoulder. Cool stone. Warm pulse underneath. Maybe imagination. Maybe not. Here's what nobody tells you about being chased. Even if you escape, the memory runs with you. You feel it in your calves. In your lungs. In the startled way your eyes flick toward every sudden movement. And for Daphne, even rooted, even transformed, she's still remembered through that chase. But tonight, let's flip the lens. Let's tell it like this. Daphne didn't become a tree to escape Apollo. She became a tree to outlive him. To dig in, stretch upward, bloom with every spring while he remained frozen in his longing. She became an emblem of permanence. Of refusal that turned into legacy. Because centuries from now, thousands, even, her name will still be spoken. Her leaves will still be worn. Her story, still told. And that is a kind of power no god ever expected. You rest beneath her once more. This time not as a spectator, but as a listener. The leaves murmur overhead, brushing against one another like shy conversations. Somewhere in the distance, Apollo plays a quiet song. It no longer chases. It waits. It remembers. Historians may never agree on what Daphne wanted. Poets may rewrite her into romance. Sculptors may freeze her into ideal forms. But in the hush of this moment, as her branches sway gently above you, it feels like she chose this. Like she knew exactly what she was doing. And so do you. You don't move for a long time. Lying under Daphne's branches, stone or imagined, myth or memory, you start to feel your breath slow. There's a rhythm in the leaves, something older than language, something like a heartbeat that doesn't need blood. And as the wind settles into lullaby patterns, you begin to hear it, a new kind of story, told without voices, without pursuit. Just presence. Stillness. But Apollo isn't done, not yet. Gods rarely are. They don't sleep, and they certainly don't quit while they're behind. Which brings you to a side of him most myths skim over, his heartbreak hobby list. Because after Daphne, Apollo doesn't become celibate or wise or magically respectful. No. He just keeps falling in love, with the same unstoppable enthusiasm and questionable boundaries. And somehow, every love story ends in tragedy. Let's start with Hyacinthus. The boy was radiant. A Spartan prince with curls that would make cherubs weep and a discus throw that rivaled the gods. You watch them in a golden field, Apollo teaching him to aim, laughing as Hyacinthus spins too fast and stumbles into the grass. It looks like love. It feels like love. But of course, it can't last. Depending on the version, and there are a few, Hyacinthus is either accidentally struck by a discus thrown by Apollo, or by Zephyrus, the jealous wind god, who got tired of being ignored. The result is the same. The boy falls, beautiful and broken, crimson staining the wildflowers around him. Apollo cries over his body, cradling it as he once cradled his lyre. And from the blood, he causes a new flower to bloom, the hyacinth, marked with what the Greeks said were the letters AI, a sound of mourning. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The ancient Greeks often tied flowers to myths of grief and transformation. The anemone for Adonis. The narcissus for Narcissus, obviously. These weren't just symbols, they were reminders, growing from the earth as eternal footnotes to divine mistakes. Now, your quirky tidbit, some botanists argue that what we call a hyacinth today probably isn't the same flower the Greeks meant. In fact, it might have been an iris. Or even a fritillary. So, botanic identity theft has been happening since at least 700 BCE. You leave the field and find yourself in the shadow of Mount Parnassus. Apollo's music echoes through the caves, low and searching. He still wears the laurel. still sings hymns. But you can hear the cracks now. Each verse drips with names he couldn't save, people he couldn't hold. And perhaps worst of all, lovers he tried to mold. There's Coronis, too, a mortal woman who actually loved him back. For a while, at least. Until she didn't. Apollo, ever watchful, hears through a raven that she's taken a mortal lover. And just like that, he lashes out, not at the man, not even directly at her, but by sending Artemis to do the dirty work. Coronis dies. But from her ashes rises Asclepius, the god of healing, one of the rare divine children born from tragedy who actually does some good in the world. You've seen his staff before, serpent entwined, now the global medical symbol. Historians still debate whether Asclepius's myth is a redemption arc for Apollo or just narrative cleanup. After all, you can't have the god of medicine birthed by a jealous act of vengeance without someone asking questions. And yet, the pattern holds. Every love ends in loss. Every pursuit, in regret. Every attempt to control, in transformation. And somehow, Apollo never quite learns. Or maybe he does, and keeps hoping the next one will be different. You walk beside him now as he wanders a shoreline, singing to the sea, asking no one in particular why love seems to flee him. It's a good question. But maybe the answer lies not in his lovers, but in himself. You see, Apollo doesn't love as a mortal would. He loves like the sun, constant, overwhelming, too bright to linger near for long. And mortals, or even nymphs and demigods, aren't built for that kind of intensity. They wither, burn, or run. Like Daphne. Like Hyacinthus. Like Coronis. You sit at the water's edge as the waves lap gently at your toes. The laurel branches sway above. And suddenly, it's not just Daphne's story anymore. It's a pattern of pursuit and resistance, of divinity colliding with fragility, of fire trying to marry rain. You wonder what would happen if Apollo ever loved gently, quietly, without music or miracles, just presence. But maybe that's not in his nature. Maybe the gods need to be extreme to be remembered. Still, you can't help noticing, each time Apollo fails to hold love, something grows in its place. A flower. A god of healing. A tree that crowns poets for centuries. Maybe, just maybe, his failures are what make him valuable. Not as a role model, but as a mirror. A reminder that even gods don't get it right. That desire isn't always destiny. That love, at its most powerful, doesn't chase. It stays. You wake in a grove that feels different, not ancient or tragic, but reverent, quiet, and just a little surreal. The air is warm but no longer stifling. It smells of sweet herbs and river water. And somewhere nearby, there's laughter, not divine or echoing, just human, soft and forgettable. You're not watching gods anymore. You're watching their echoes ripple through time. Because Daphne's myth didn't stop at the roots of a single tree. It spread, branching out into stories, interpretations, wild theories, and whispers that historians still haven't agreed on. Tonight, you step into one of those theories. You're in Arcadia now, and the grove is thick with olive, laurel, and wild figure. It's dusk, and shadows stretch long across a circle of stones, some toppled, others painted with red and black spirals that predate Apollo by centuries. This place was sacred long before he arrived, long before Zeus hurled his first lightning bolt. And the people who once walked here didn't call themselves Greeks. They didn't worship Apollo. They worshipped the grove itself. Some scholars believe Daphne isn't just a character, she's a remnant. A fossil from older, earth-centered belief systems that didn't need gods to chase women to explain nature. In those older systems, transformation wasn't punishment. It was a return. You sit in the grass now, letting that idea wrap around you. That maybe Daphne wasn't fleeing Apollo. Maybe she was fleeing Olympus. The whole glittering, arrogant pantheon that stormed through older mythologies and repainted everything in their image. What if Daphne wasn't the hunted girl, but the vanishing goddess? There's a fringe theory, almost never taught in schools, that Daphne was originally part of an ancient triad of tree spirits, along with Dryope and Hamadryas. Spirits who didn't just live in trees, but were the trees. They were loved by shepherds and feared by kings. Not because they were weak, but because they couldn't be tamed. And when Apollo came thundering in, wrapped in prophecy and golden glow, the stories changed. She became a girl. He became the hero. And the tree? Just set dressing. Historians still argue over how mythologies evolve when new civilizations overwrite old ones. The Olympians are famous for it, absorbing local deities, renaming spirits, folding everything into their tiny 12-seat table. It's a kind of cultural imperialism, but with more thunderbolts and fewer ceasefires. But you, sitting here beneath stars that predate all of it, feel the weight of what was lost. Or maybe just hidden. Now your quirky tidbit, there are actual laurel trees in modern Greece that are named after Daphne. Locals believe some of them are descended from her form. Pilgrims still leave offerings there, ribbons, coins, bits of handwritten poetry tucked in the bark like secrets. Whether or not they believe the myth, they act like they do. And that belief? It's carved into the tree rings. You reach out to touch one. The bark is rough, but not unkind. The leaves twitch gently, not in warning, but welcome. You imagine, just for a second, what it would be like to dissolve into this, to stop running, stop being watched, and simply grow. No shrine, no poem, just quiet photosynthesis. In this light, Daphne becomes something more than a myth. She becomes possibility. A story that resists final form, that keeps adapting, that refuses to die just because no one's writing new lines for her. And Apollo? Maybe he knows it. Maybe that's why he keeps wearing the laurel, not just to honor her, but to remind himself of the one being he couldn't rewrite. The one who got away. You move now through another kind of space, a library lit by oil lamps, scrolls piled high, ink still damp on some of them. A scholar reads aloud from a parchment, an early Roman adaptation of the myth, where Daphne isn't changed by her father but by Gaia herself. A divine intervention from the Earth Mother to protect her last daughters from Olympus's hungriest sons. It's more radical, more powerful. It's also completely forgotten. You linger beside the scholar as they sigh and roll up the scroll. It won't be copied again. It's too strange, too uncomfortable for polite epics. But you remember it. Because stories live in listeners, not shelves. You drift to the window and gaze out at a hill covered in moonlit laurel. The leaves whisper again, but this time, it sounds like a promise. That some stories don't need an ending. That maybe Daphne never was the ending. Just the first branch on a larger tree. The moon is high now, white and watchful, and the laurel grove gleams like silver embroidery stitched into the dark. You walk through the hush, feeling like a shadow of something older, softer, half-dreamed. This is no longer just Daphne's myth. It's a map of meanings, layered, overwritten, rediscovered. And tonight, you stumble on one of those rediscoveries. In the clearing ahead is a wooden circle surrounded by flame-lit figures. No togas, no lyres. Just cloaks, bare feet, and expressions carved by wind and ritual. You've landed in a druidic grove, not Greek, not Roman, but Celtic, northern, wild in a different direction. And you're here to learn a secret Daphne never knew she shared. Because laurel isn't just sacred in Greece. It's sacred everywhere. In these woods, laurel burns in purification rites. It's tied to doors to banish illness. Dried leaves are placed under pillows to stir dreams of truth. Laurel crowns don't mark victory here, they ward off madness. And in the center of the circle, the druid leader lifts a wreath skyward and speaks words in a language no one has heard for centuries. Still, you understand, this is a tree of protection, of clarity, of change. Funny, isn't it? The same plant that once marked pursuit now marks pause. You sit among the circle, the fire crackling low. The woman beside you leans over and whispers an old folk belief. If you burn laurel leaves at the winter solstice and speak aloud what you fear, the smoke will carry it away before spring. It's a tiny ritual, tucked into a colossal myth. But you feel its weight. Because sometimes it's not about escape or punishment or divine theater. Sometimes it's about survival. About telling your truth to the flame and letting the wind take it somewhere you can't follow. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Laurel was widely used in oracular traditions across ancient Europe. In addition to the Delphic Pythia, Celtic seers would drink laurel-infused teas or inhale the scent of smoldering leaves to induce prophetic trance. This cross-cultural use suggests a shared reverence for the plant's supposed connection to insight and boundary crossing. And now, for tonight's quirky gem, in 17th century England, laurel trees were sometimes planted at the entrance to houses to confuse witches. Supposedly, spirits couldn't pass through if they couldn't name the plant, like some supernatural spelling bee gone wrong. You step out of the circle and into a different kind of grove, this one modern, neatly trimmed, part of a university botanical garden. A student is kneeling beside a young laurel bush, attaching a laminated sign that reads Laurus Nobilis. You watch her tuck a sprig behind her ear and take a selfie, unaware of the 1,000 years she just brushed against. Because the truth is, we're still telling Daphne's story. Every graduation ceremony, every academic robe and laurel hood, every poem ending into the muse, it's all traces of that same root. The chase, the change, the crown. We've just polished it, softened the edges, left out the part where the muse said no. Historians still argue whether modern appropriations of laurel symbolism do justice to its mythic roots. Some say it's a triumph, how a tree of trauma became a plant of peace. Others see erasure, the smoothing over of a difficult, defiant tale into a neat academic flourish. You take a seat on a park bench, watching students pass by, some with earbuds, some with books. None of them seem to notice the laurel hedge that lines the path, or the bronze plaque hidden among the leaves. You lean in to read it. Daphne, daughter of the earth, became the first laureate. Her roots run deeper than we know. A breeze stirs the branches above you. And just for a moment, you see her again, not fleeing, not frozen, but walking calmly into the trees. Choosing them. Choosing stillness. Her gaze steady, her footsteps soft, her myth still forming with every leaf that falls. You sit back, eyes closing, and let the modern world blur. Because whether crowned by poets, protected by druids, or burned by witches, the laurel tree stands. Not as a monument to conquest, but as a boundary no god could cross. You open your eyes to a frescoed ceiling glowing with candlelight. Gold leaf catches every flicker, every breath of flame, turning shadows into angels and regrets into saints. You're in a Renaissance palace now, but not as a guest. You drift like a thought, a memory, a line of poetry half-whispered. And everywhere you look, Daphne. She's on the walls, mid-sprint. On the tapestries, hair unraveling into vines. On marble statues, limbs caught between flesh and bark, her mouth open in silent refusal. Artists can't seem to leave her alone. And neither can Apollo. He stands at the edge of every painting, expression taut with longing. Sometimes he's heroic, sometimes pathetic, always reaching, never touching. It's here, in this era of powdered wigs and perfumed drama, that Daphne's myth experiences its biggest glow-up and its biggest misunderstanding. Because to the Renaissance mind, hers is the ultimate metaphor, chaste beauty resisting lust. Daphne becomes the darling of moralists, the goddess of no means no, the patron saint of running away from creepy lute players. In some adaptations, she's even praised for her virtue, as if turning into a tree was the classy thing to do when flirted with too aggressively. But you know better. You were there. You know it wasn't virtue. It was survival. Still, the image sticks. Apollo chasing. Daphne fleeing. Artists eat it up. John Lorenzo Bernini, Renaissance rock star sculptor, churns out a masterpiece so real you swear the marble is breathing. He catches the exact moment bark curls around Daphne's calves, fingers blooming into twigs. The sculpture is so dynamic, so intimate, so final that it feels like she's still moving, trying to leave the gallery even now. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Bernini sculpted Apollo and Daphne when he was just 24. The piece is considered one of the greatest Baroque sculptures ever made, so detailed that even the veins on Daphne's hands are visible as they transform into leaves. And here's the quirky twist. To view Bernini's sculpture properly, you're meant to walk around it in motion. Standing still ruins it. Because this is not a statue of stasis. It's a statue of almost. You glide past the silk-draped nobles admiring her, their powdered faces frozen in admiration. Some see beauty. Others see tragedy. A few see themselves. And maybe that's the point. Daphne's story, retold in oil and stone, becomes a canvas for every kind of gaze. Feminine resistance. Masculine pursuit. Divine heartbreak. And somewhere between the brushstrokes, something tender happens. Apollo stops being feared. He starts being pitied. You find him painted in a quieter corner of the room, not chasing, not singing. Just sitting under a laurel tree, lyre on his lap, head bowed. The caption reads, Apollo, after. He's still crowned, still golden. But there's something different in his posture. Something that almost feels like reflection. Historians still argue whether Renaissance artists meant to soften Apollo or merely romanticize him. Some critics say they recast him as a tragic lover to avoid confronting the violence in his pursuit. Others say the era's obsession with balance, between passion and purity, chaos and order, naturally turn him into a cautionary figure. But in these frescoed halls, nobody's reading citations. They're just staring. And somewhere inside that stare, Daphne becomes more than bark and bone. She becomes a mood. Not fear. Not desire. Distance. Refusal. Power. You drift now into a library across the hall. Here, poets hunch over parchment, scrawling odes and epics, flipping through well-thumbed volumes of Ovid's Metamorphoses. One young man taps his quill to his lips and writes, "Even the gods fall short of grace when desire outruns wisdom." You smile. It's not a bad line. He scratches it out and replaces it with something more palatable. But you remember it. Because in the end, that's what Daphne teaches, not just how to run, but why. Not just how to say no, but how to grow roots in your refusal. To become so still, so anchored, that even time must pause and think twice before continuing. You step back into the candlelit gallery. Apollo's song is softer now, woven into the flicker of torchlight. It no longer chases. It waits. And above you, high on a painted ceiling, a tree stretches her branches toward the stars. Still out of reach. Still choosing her shape. Still not finished. Time uncoils like ivy as you walk into a world that no longer worships gods, but still dreams in their language. The stone halls, the laurel crowns, the marble sculptors, they all fade now, giving way to a colder light, a sharper air. You're in a lecture hall, 21st century, projector humming, students hunched in hoodies and beanies, scribbling notes on mythology slides that flicker with copyright-free paintings. And yet, Daphne's still here. She flickers across the screen, caught mid-metamorphosis, her image pixelated just enough to feel wrong. A voice at the front of the room, a professor, sharp-eyed and caffeine-fueled, explains her story. She ran, he says. Not because she hated Apollo, necessarily, but because she valued her independence. In many interpretations, she represents pre-Olympian resistance. A symbol of autonomy in a world that didn't offer much. A few heads nod. One student raises a hand and asks if Daphne could be considered the first environmentalist. The class chuckles. But the professor smiles. That's not so far-fetched. She didn't just escape. She became nature. Not to hide in it, but to join it. You settle into the back row, watching this modern unraveling of ancient myth. Not worship now, just curiosity. Deconstruction. Analysis. But even here, even reduced to a slideshow, Daphne pulses beneath the surface, refusing to be pinned down. Every interpretation is a guess. Every guess, incomplete. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Mythology studies in the 20th and 21st centuries began to reframe female figures like Daphne through feminist and psychoanalytic lenses. Scholars like Jung and Freud, problematic in their own ways, viewed her transformation as a defense mechanism, an escape into stasis to preserve identity when faced with overwhelming force. But in modern feminist theory, Daphne is increasingly seen not as passive or tragic, but revolutionary. She denies the narrative. She rewrites the ending. And your quirky tidbit? There's a species of plant, Daphne miserium, whose flowers are exquisitely beautiful, but toxic. In folklore, it's called the Lady Laurel. Some rural traditions claim if you fall asleep under it, you'll dream of all the things you never said out loud. Fitting. Back in the classroom, the professor shifts topics. The screen now shows NASA's Apollo mission badge, eagle, moon, laurel ringed in stars. And suddenly, you feel it again, how far this story has traveled. From groves to gods, to rockets and modern science. The laurel never really left. In fact, the Apollo missions themselves were named not just for the god's association with light, but for his symbolic ties to prophecy, clarity, and forward vision. The irony? They left Daphne out of it. As usual. Still, she's there. In the silence between the launch countdowns. In the moonlit stillness after the dust settles. In the wreaths of achievement that circle the heads of people who don't even remember where the tradition started. Historians still debate whether the appropriation of myth into modern institutions cheapens or honors the original tales. Is Apollo's name on a spaceship a tribute, or just branding? Is the laurel a living symbol, or just costume jewelry for ceremony? But you, perched unseen at the edge of this classroom, know better. Symbols evolve. Myths drift. But stories like Daphne's cling to the edges of culture like stubborn leaves in winter. Because we need her. We need her to remind us that saying no is ancient, that boundaries are sacred, that becoming something untouchable can sometimes be the bravest possible choice. You step out of the lecture hall and into the city. The laurel follows. It's on logos, on medals, on tattoos, in poetry, open mics, and quiet book dedications. It crowns the heads of people who've never run from anything but still feel the echo of the chase. You pause on a subway platform. Across from you, a girl with a green hoodie leans against a column. She's drawing something in her sketchbook. You lean over her shoulder, not too close, and glimpse it. A woman turning into a tree. No label, no caption. Just limbs becoming branches, eyes closed, mouth still. You smile. She doesn't know you're watching, but you know what she's done. She's remembered. Not the god, not the chase, the choice. You step away from the train platform and into something even stranger than myth, modern quiet. Not the hush of sacred groves or library stillness, but the kind of stillness cities give at 3 a.m., when the streets are empty and everything echoes. The buildings don't chant Apollo's name here. The trees are planted in straight lines. But still, laurel grows in sidewalk cracks, forgotten planters, urban corners where no god should linger. And yet, you feel him. Not in person, but in residue. In language. In the things we still call laurels. You pass a bookstore, locked and dark, but in the window is a poetry collection titled Wreaths and Ashes. Inside, pages probably filled with metaphors about longing, roots, escape. A quiet tribute. The poet may not even know she's writing Apollo and Daphne all over again, but she is. Because at its core, this myth isn't about gods. It's about patterns. And you see the pattern everywhere. A young woman walks faster when a stranger follows too closely. A teenage boy writes a love letter and never sends it. A musician writes a song for someone who won't answer texts, then calls it inspiration. A CEO gets praised for being a laureate of the industry, while never realizing he's invoking a nymph who chose not to be claimed by greatness. The myth lives on, reshaped by headlines, marketing, broken-hearted tweets. Apollo's desire becomes a playlist. Daphne's sprint becomes a survival strategy. Tonight, you walk through those echoes. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The word laureate comes from the Latin laureatus, meaning crown with laurel. It's the reason we have Nobel laureates, poet laureates, Olympic medals ringed with laurel motifs. This root winds through language and ceremony alike, gently reinforcing an old idea that achievement must be marked, that honor must be worn, that victory looks like leaves. But tonight, the quirky fact is even better. In modern herbal medicine, laurel, or bay, leaves are believed to enhance intuition. Some spiritualists recommend burning them during meditations to reveal things hidden or to invoke clarity. Not prophecy exactly, just perspective. Which is really what Daphne gave Apollo. Eventually, you keep walking until the city falls behind. Until the pavement cracks open into gravel, then dust, then forest floor. You're back where you started, somehow, but it's different now. The trees here don't lean away from you. They don't hide Daphne or bury Apollo's guilt. They just stand. Old, patient, honest. And in their shade, you find something new. A circle of stones. A stump grown smooth by time. And in the center, just a sprig of laurel. No crown. No plaque. Just leaves. Still, green, untouched. You sit. You don't ask for answers. You don't summon prophecy. You just listen. Because here, Daphne's story isn't being told. It is. It hums through your ribs like wind. It taps at your ankles like roots. It fills your chest with something that feels a lot like understanding, but quieter. Not closure. Just presence. Historians still argue whether myths like Daphne's should be taught as cautionary tales, empowerment stories, or historical artifacts. Are they too problematic to revere? Too beautiful to dissect? Too ancient to be relevant? You think about the girl on the subway sketching trees from memory. The professor naming her resistance. The poet slipping laurel between the lines. And you know the answer. Myths endure not because they're perfect, but because they bend, because they change with us, and because some of them, like Daphne's, feel like they were written not on scrolls but into the body, into the soles of feet that know when to run, and the hands that remember how to root. Apollo, for all his golden splendor, never really understood that. But you do. You lie back, letting the leaves blur against the sky. They rustle not like whispers anymore, but like applause. Gentle, reluctant, earned. You came here thinking this was a story about a god who chased a girl into a tree. But it's not. It's about a girl who turned herself into a forest no god could follow. And in doing so, became the story no one could forget. The night deepens around you, velvet dark and filled with stars. Not the orderly constellations drawn by stargazers on scrolls, but wild, flickering lights scattered like the thoughts of a restless sky. And somewhere beyond the canopy, far beyond this grove where Daphne sleeps, you hear echoes of her name, whispered not in Greek or Latin, but in code, in satellites, in the silence between data packets. Because even here, even now, she endures. Not as bark, not as leaves, but as signal. You're floating through a digital landscape now. Screens glow in sterile labs, satellites orbit with quiet, perfect indifference, and somewhere deep in NASA's archives, you pass the name again, Apollo. The program that put humans on the moon. That reached beyond the gods and landed in their domain. But guess what they planted when they returned? A patch of laurel at mission control. Not officially ceremonial. Just there. A nod, perhaps, to inspiration, to mythology, or maybe to irony, that even as we left Earth, we carried its oldest stories with us. You drift into a command center now. The room is dim. A giant screen shows a rotating model of the moon. A mission specialist sips cold coffee and reviews telemetry. And tucked into the corner of his monitor is a sticker, a laurel crown with a caption beneath it, still running. He doesn't notice you. But you smile. Because that's the truth, isn't it? Daphne never stopped running. Not really. She just outpaced the story. And Apollo? He's everywhere now, in the names of missions, in app logos, in middle school textbooks. He survived by becoming useful, by being translated. But Daphne? She survived by refusing translation. She doesn't power satellites. She doesn't appear on commemorative coins. She's not a brand. She's a boundary. And boundaries don't advertise themselves. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During the Cold War, US and Soviet scientists often invoked classical mythology in naming scientific endeavors. Apollo, Orion, Artemis, Prometheus. The language of ancient gods became shorthand for innovation, ambition, conquest. It was meant to sound timeless, visionary. But never once, not once, was a spacecraft named Daphne. She was too still, too subtle, too much like a warning. And your quirky detail? A 2006 project to name newly discovered asteroids almost resulted in one being called Daphne, not after the myth, but because its orbit was evasive and unexpectedly irregular. The name was approved. The asteroid's official designation is 41 Daphne. You look it up. It's small, quiet, spinning far from everything, still in motion. Of course it is. You float now through a stream of data and memory, through screensavers and satellites, through the stories humanity keeps rebooting for every generation. You land softly in a classroom where a child draws a girl becoming a tree. You pass a concert hall where a composer names his new sweet metamorphosis. You listen to a podcast where a soft voice says, "Welcome to the Daphne Diaries, where we discuss healing through solitude." No one tells her whole story anymore, but they all tell parts of it. She's not preserved in marble. She's scattered. Every woman who changed her name and moved cities to be free. Every man who chose softness over pursuit. Every poem that ends in silence. Every boundary that holds. Historians still argue whether mythology is best understood through academic analysis or emotional resonance. Whether we should teach Apollo's story as a symbol of pursuit, or Daphne's as resistance. But you, now folded gently into the hush between stars and root, know the secret they don't teach. Daphne didn't want to be understood. She wanted to remain. Unclaimed. Undefeated. And so she did. In bark, in blood, in orbit. She's still saying no. And no, as it turns out, is a kind of immortality. You feel the wind pick up, cool, clean, almost reverent. It carries the smell of night blossoms and scorched circuits. Of laurel and ozone. Two worlds wrapped around each other like myth and memory. You sit once more beneath a tree, not laurel, not sacred, just present. And above you, a satellite glints across the sky like a thrown discus, curving past Earth's shoulder. You wonder what Apollo would say, watching it. Maybe he'd be proud. Maybe he'd write a song. Maybe he'd whisper into the night sky, wondering if she sees. But you don't wait for his answer. You already know she does. Now the wind is slower, softer. It moves more like breath than breeze. The kind of air that settles over landscapes just before dawn, not quite dark, not quite light. And you? You're almost still. Almost finished. But not quite. Because stories like Daphne's don't end with a full stop. They taper. Like the last curl of a leaf. Like the quiet that follows a symphony you didn't know was over. You lie back now beneath a canopy that stretches wider than any myth. The stars above you don't spell out gods anymore. They just shine. Indifferent. Constant. And below, the roots that once held Daphne, whatever she was, whatever she became, have grown deeper. Woven into myth, yes. But also into something gentler. Memory. Tonight, you're not chasing her. You're listening. The silence between the leaves has weight now. It's not empty. It's earned. It holds the pulse of every woman who said no. Every story that took a detour. Every path that vanished into forest. Because Daphne's tale, at its core, isn't about punishment or power. It's about transformation. The kind no one else chooses for you. The kind you take, alone, because you must. And as the laurel rustles overhead, you feel it, not as thunder or fire or divine intervention, but as stillness. As selfhood. Here's your final mainstream historical fact. In many ancient cultures, trees were believed to house spirits, ancestors, gods. But the laurel? It was said to listen. People whispered confessions to it. Left secrets tied in ribbon. It was both altar and witness. And your last quirky tidbit? Some say if you dream beneath a laurel tree on a full moon, you'll see not the future, but the truth. Not what will happen, but what is buried deep beneath bark and breath and silence. You sit up slowly. The grove is lighter now. Not from fire. From release. Apollo's footsteps no longer echo. The chase has stopped. Not because he gave up, but because you outgrew the story. And when you look across the field, you see something new. Not a god. Not a girl. Just a tree. Tall. Strong. Undisturbed. You walk toward it. Not in pursuit. In peace. You touch the trunk. Rough. Alive. And finally, you whisper, I understand. And for once, nothing answers. And that's exactly how it should be.